Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today my guest is Issam Nassar. Issam Nassar is professor of history at Illinois State University, but currently is at the Doha Institute as director of graduate studies. Issam published a number of works related to photography in Palestine, but today we're going to talk about his personal life in Jerusalem. And later, we're going to talk about Wasif Jawhariyyeh, as together with Salim Tamari, he edited the diary and memoirs of this very important character for the history of Jerusalem. Issam, welcome.
Thank you.
Issam, the first question, the question that I ask all my guests is, what is your Jerusalem? In other words, what is your connection with a city?
It's a rather kind of long connection in some sense that predates my existence. As I come from a family on my mother's side who were Jerusalemites for centuries. I mean, I cannot tell when was exactly the point in which they migrated from Crete to Jerusalem, but certainly a few hundred years before. And my father, who comes from a village near, the family also migrated to Jerusalem early 20th century. So in a sense, my family were Jerusalemites who had, businesses and moved gradually up into the economic ladder, that they moved outside of the old city, despite the fact that the business was in the old city. So there is that package that comes with memories that I acquired from my family about the cousin in Al-Baqa and the house in, now I forgot the name, Mosrara, the part that was no man's land where our house used to be. So there was that, all that lingo and talk about things that were part of my growing up without even realizing what it meant at the time. Personally, I was born in Jerusalem, and being the son of a father who had his business, his store in Jerusalem, although from 1960s we moved to Ramallah, but every day after school I would just go to Jerusalem to the store to help my father in the store until the late hours of the evening. And then when I grew up, it will be, where I would hang out and spend the night sometimes. So somehow Jerusalem was in and out of my growing up. Of course, that's one element. The other element is I decided to study Jerusalem mainly because of particular fascination with smells and sounds of the city somehow. I think that's probably was more. So I spent decades of my life now researching various aspects of the modern history of Jerusalem particularly.
Fascinating. You just mentioned smells and sounds. Your work is very much about photography. So instead of talking about photography now, I really want to explore this idea of looking at smells and sounds. Are there unique smells and sounds in Jerusalem?
Well, yes, I think so. And I think, each place has its own smells and sounds. But Jerusalem, if you look at, to me, there were like three kinds of smells. And this is, I am talking about me, the child. There is the smells of the old city. And the smells of the old city are always related to either spices or frankincense or these kind of oriental, I suppose, and I use it loosely here, smells of the place. And the sounds were always sounds of a mixture of the muazzin and the bells, the towers, or bell towers, vendors screaming, selling nana, mint, or tomatoes, or something else. So there is that particular old city smell that I'm always associated myself with. But then there was the newer city, or the outside of the city, the East Jerusalem smells, which were rather different. They had no spices. They had no, the occasional smell of the ka'ak, the Jerusalem bread, which is mostly I associated with al-Musrara more than the old city somehow. And then there's the West Jerusalem, the Israeli section, or Israeli occupied section in 1948, which in the beginning as a child, I used to have this smell of cinnamon, which is usually part of what they call sort of like buns that we were not familiar with in the East at the time. They're like, kind of, I don't know if it's Eastern European or, the kind of smells you smell in a mall nowadays when you go to the food court. So there's always that thing. And of course, the sounds there were always about cars, lots of cars, moving cars, and traffic lights and things like this, which in my young age in Jerusalem, they were limited to the western part of the city, and not to the eastern part, or they did not exist in Ramallah or in any other areas.
I never thought about the city in terms of sounds and smell. With a previous guest, we were discussing the fact that Jerusalem has also colors. And these guests mentioned the fact that, when you look at people walking around Jerusalem, you often have this perception that is dark, in a sense that you have religious communities, whether Jewish, Muslim, or Christians, that tend to wear dark colors. And, in certain periods of the year, they do represent some sort of a majority of the people walking around the city. And then I made the point that it's in stark contrast with the white stone of Jerusalem. Do you see the city through colors too? Do you have particular colors associated with the city of Jerusalem?
Not as much. I mean, I have, of course, some visual imagination, but not colors as much. But I see your point about the, blackness related to religious people in some sense. But to me, they are part of the scene. But when I think of the old city, particularly the colors of the dresses of the Fallahi women, the peasant women who came from the countryside to sell. I remember these things, or fresh mint, green, or vegetables. And I'm thinking here mostly of the Damascus Gate area. So I think there are these other contrasting colors. And also from my childhood, when I was young, say in the 70s, Jerusalem was, or the old city particularly, was full of tourists. And the tourists back in those days tend to be, but they were also not just religious pilgrims, but they were also, young men and women who came on vacation from, say, Germany or Italy or something like this, just to hang out. They visited the old city and they went to the Dead Sea and other areas. So, and back in the days, I remember there were few kind of taverns in the old city where these foreigners would hang out. So the scene, I have to say, in my childhood was more secular, if that's the right word to use here, than when I visit the city and I only see Jews in ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox Jews in black or particular attire, or Muslim women in jalabiya, you know, in an Islamic dress, or Muslim men who are dressed as if they just came from 7th century Arabia. And I don't know how, I mean, I don't know what they dressed in 7th century Arabia, but that's the impression you get. No, back in the days, it was a lot different, I think. And maybe the, you know, trend towards more religiosity, maybe the conflicts in the last 20 years that kind of made Jerusalem unimportant for young Europeans traveling to the city. I don't know.
Perhaps you have been influenced by the fact that your work is very much about a Jerusalem in black and white. And I was wondering how, you know, your work looking at pictures and photography influence also your view of the city. How did you negotiate that black and white that you have studied with your upbringing in the Jerusalem of the 1970s?
Yeah. Well, let me think for a minute. I think, to me, somehow working with old photographs, you know, 19th and early 20th century photographs that tend to be black and white or yellow and brown somehow, that's somehow made me maybe see color as something that is added or artificial in some sense to the sense of authenticity. Now, I'm not saying that that is the case, but I'm saying that's my feeling. So in other words, when I go to Jerusalem, I look at stones or at stores and I almost see them. If they have some historical significance, I see them in the eye of my mind in black and white. But if they were just, you know, like a new Israeli settlement that was just implanted outside in some area, that's certainly in color. And color to me seemed to me, in my mind, again, this is not material reality, to be associated with fakeness, as if, you know, something added that is a burden on the authenticity of the city. Of course, I'm reflecting personally here. This is not you know, I am not describing a material reality in some sense. But yes, in terms of what is kind of, in my mind, more authentic, that belongs to earlier times, I immediately almost see it in black and white. And maybe my example before about the young hippies in the 1970s visiting the city, they will always seem like to be out of place, outsiders, and they were colorful. So maybe there's also some sort of unconscious layer here of seeing color again as something that just superimposed on the city or just came to the city somehow.
You mainly worked on sort of European photography of Jerusalem, but you also looked at Palestinian photography, local photographers who engage with business, but also with the arts of photography. If you were to sum up, what is the Jerusalem encapsulated in photography? Would it be just buildings, holy places, or there's something more, something that perhaps at a superficial level we cannot see?
Well, the Jerusalem encapsulated in early photography, say 19th and even perhaps well into the British Mandate period, first decades of the 20th century, was largely about an imaginary place that kind of does not exist on its own. It's there. It was more about buildings and about locations that are associated either with the Bible or with some particular imagination or another that is largely religious. And in that sense, even if people or representatives of the society or of the economy appear in the picture, they were incidental, because what mattered more is the Dome of the Rock or the Holy Sepulchre or whatever it is, not the people who just happen to kind of jump into the picture. That is the historical kind of mostly European, but also local Palestinian, early Palestinian photographers who were catering to the tourist market. They were also producing these kind of biblical images. Now, when we come to closer, particularly to 1948, I want to say, although the local photography goes, you know, from probably 1880s, maybe even a bit earlier, we start to see photos that are more about events and people. And I'm talking about here professional photographers. I'm not talking about the personal albums. I can talk about that if you like more. You start to see, you know, defenders of Jerusalem, or surrender of Jerusalem, or exchange of prisoners. And all of a sudden you start to see, which is also not Jerusalem, it's really war. But it's happening in Jerusalem. It's really grand politics through war that's happening in Jerusalem. The alternative to that is what you see in private hands, is like the personal and family photographs. And that is where you see these intimate moments, people performing to the camera, sitting leisurely around dinner table, or you know, posing in front of one of the gates of the old city or the other, or in front of their new house in Talbiya or Baqa or some other place. So, you know, you cannot just say that photography is about one thing, but I think there are dominant themes in each kind of category. And ironically, they don't intersect much. You know, it's like the European kind of Orientalist biblical photography stands on its own, and war photography and conflict photography stands on its own. And then there is that element that's always missing, which is the personal Jerusalem, the social Jerusalem, the economic Jerusalem.
You made me think about something that previous guest was talking about, particularly about you know, the fact that these photographies didn't talk to each other; they were different, you know, and at the same time capturing the same environment. And it made me think about Salim Tamari, who talked about his childhood too, and he talked about particularly the period after 67, which was dramatic, tragic, but at the same time borderless. People moved and got to know the other part, which nowadays is obviously very different given the walls. Now, that doesn't mean that there were no borders. There were borders, obviously. They were just invisible. I was wondering if also photography, you think, has changed given the fact that people had the possibility to see different parts of Jerusalem, and if so, if it somehow helped understanding each other, or even creating more borders later.
Well, I guess that takes us into post-67 photography. I am not sure it changed much. I think, you know, even though the city was so-called unified or colonized by one side now rather than by multiple sides, it's still, you know, each community, the colonized and the colonizers, or the Israelis and the Palestinians, or the East Jerusalem and the West Jerusalem, each community kind of functioned differently. And I am, you know, I've seen works of Israeli photographers who took pictures in the old city, or of the bread seller in Jerusalem, the Arab bread seller in Jerusalem, or whatever it is. But in my eyes, these images seemed as if they were going somewhere else and capturing something exotic rather than part of their own city. And I think the Palestinian photographers focused largely on the old city, and particularly on religious symbols, and perhaps on some cultural activities here and there, but mostly remained functioning within sort of Palestinian sphere or an Arab or Islamic Christian sphere. So somehow I don't think, the photography helped the interaction or bringing together Jerusalem, rather separated it even more. While the Israeli policies were trying to bring it together, unify it, I think the everyday imagination produced or emphasized by photography and film was functioning differently, I think.
Certainly, film is another area at some point I need to explore for the podcast. I think there's a lot of material out there, and yet it's interesting. There are no real movies about Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is part of many movies in different ways. So I guess there are also difficulties in how to portray Jerusalem within, like not a stationary picture, but again, a movie picture, a motion picture, something that is moving. The complexities of crossing borders and, again, feeling part of a different area, depending who you are and depending where you move from and to. So I leave it there. I just want to move from photography, talking about another piece of your work, but this has to deal with an individual, which is going to be at the center of a second part of the interview. With Salim Tamari, you edited the diary and memoir of a Jerusalemite who was unknown to many, to myself indeed. The first publication in Arabic and the translation into English has changed not just the academic word and the academic perception and, of writing the history of Jerusalem in the early 20th century, but I think this has also become a popular narrative, and people are now referring to the life and times of Wassif Jawhariyyeh. Who was Wassif?
Wasif was a Jerusalemite par excellence, I would say. He was born in the old city of Jerusalem in the Saadiyya neighborhood or quarter of the city, which is now generally speaking described as part of the Muslim quarter. A Christian Orthodox Palestinian born in what is now we think of as Muslim, but in fact these were just names given by the British mandate. Variety of reasons we're not going to get into. And Wasif was born in late 19th century, was a young man in the first, teenager, teenager, then a young man into World War I, where he was conscripted into the Ottoman army and served with the Ottoman Navy in the Dead Sea. Which it was really a small lake within the Ottoman territories, but apparently there were lots of smuggling of wheat, food, things like this in times of war. So through that area, so he was stationed there. What made him special is a number of things, but one of them is he is known as, I'll use the term musician loosely, although now everyone talks about Wasif being the great musician. He wasn't. Wasif was a oud player, someone who played music and sang, and sang in religious ceremonies, in weddings, and was part of the social life in that sense. He was not part of the more elitist music scene. He did not necessarily write music. He has a song or two that he composed, but generally speaking, the kind of music he produced made him a household name in every wedding party or Ramadan festivities or a Christmas festivity or Purim festivity in Ottoman and later on in British Mandate Jerusalem. So in some sense, he was part of the nightlife of Jerusalem, if that is the right term to use. And in that sense, he interacted with people from many faiths, from many backgrounds. And because of his particular field of music, he also interacted or had contacts with visiting artists who came from Aleppo in Syria or from Lebanon or from Egypt to perform in Palestine. So he was also connected with that scene. So this is an element where he, as a storyteller, as someone who wrote his memoirs are rich about the cultural life and the artistic life in the city. On the other hand, he also worked as a municipal employee in the Department of Land Registration. And although that's not an important part of his memoirs, but there he has connections and interaction with superiors who were mostly British. The same way he also had connections with the municipal mayors of Jerusalem. Even before, when he was young, his father was close friend of the mayor of Jerusalem, two mayors of Jerusalem, Salim al-Husseini and Hussein al-Husseini. So he is kind of connected with the sort of milieu of the city in some sense. And so his memoirs are rich in that sense. They take you into a place that only exists in our imagination, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims, or what we call now Israelis and Arabs, or Israelis and Palestinians, were part of the same community, at least in late Ottoman period, and were engaged in activities that is similar, religious activities. They wanted someone to play music. They shared in the music scene, in the food scene. So, his memoirs also is rich in terms of anecdotes about particular individuals in the city, kind of jokers, storytellers, artists, even people who were arrested for some reason or another, or the drunken people at night, or there are all these things that you don't usually find in even the other memoirs about Jerusalem. Are all about war, or this is how it was and we lost it, and it's either nostalgia or description of greater events. But this is indeed something from within the society, from underneath. That's what makes him very special, I think.
We are going to take a short break. Please remember to join our Facebook page and also join our Twitter and Instagram accounts at Jerusalem Unplugged. If you have a story that you want to share about Jerusalem, or you want me to interview someone, please get in touch and I'll be very happy to follow through. And remember, enjoy, share, subscribe. Enjoy the rest of the podcast. There's so many aspects to talk about Wassif, and let's start with music, because you talked about the fact that he was an oud player. Hard to call him a musician, and I guess I would agree with that. But yet music is really part of the memoirs. There are episodes when he talks about listening to the radio for the first time in Jerusalem. And I was just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more about his sort of musical performances and career, and how this matched with life in Jerusalem, given the fact that, as you mentioned, from many other documents, diaries, memoirs, but also official documents, you always get the sense that Jerusalem was this dark, conservative place marked by a religious identity, which also had an impact on how people lived. And here you have a young man basically saying the opposite. Look, Jerusalem was a place for parties.
Yeah. Well, yes, Wasif was, since a young age, according to his memoirs, he loved music. And he learned music at the hands of a number of visiting musicians. He names some of them. Some were local, but he even names some famous musicians who came from Aleppo and other places. And he gradually became a well-known oud player who played in a group. And the group they were all Jerusalemites. Some of them were Christians, some were Jews, and some were Muslims. But they all played the kind of music that is the Arabic music that has the feeling of influence mostly by what was coming out of Egypt and by the traditions of the great local music in greater Syria, particularly Aleppo, I would say, as a center of more, we're not talking here about folkloric music. We're talking about, more leisurely music, I suppose. So there's that element of that music brought everyone together, which is not what we see as, and any study about Ottoman Jerusalem will talk about, 10% Christians of the population, 85% Muslims, 5% Jews, or the British Mandate. There are fights among historians where the Jewish majority or Christian or Muslim majority. That's all kind of meaningless if you look at what it meant to be part of the city of Jerusalem. And where these differences were not as significant as we think of them today after what happened in Palestine in mid-20th century on. And so in some sense, that's kind of extremely important. The other element is, he was a man of good sense of humor and seemed to be adventurous. And in his memoirs, he doesn't shy about telling intimate stories of through his musical scene of, Ottoman officers drinking, parties. In fact, even he has one page where he describes during World War I, the scene of the sailors, or not sailors, maybe fishermen, I'm not sure. He uses the word sailors, but I think he means fishermen, from Jaffa, who were conscripted in the Ottoman army, who were smoking hashish. And he even elaborates on the kinds of issues that they were facing. Of course, it's funny in itself, and to think of hashish and alcohol rather than God, Jesus, Moses, holy sites is one thing. But then even when he elaborates on these details, you get to learn, for example, what he considered the major problem that these hashish smokers faced is that hashish, according to him, and I think this is his word, hashish requires sweets. And World War I and famine and sugar was scarce, that these guys had to do with dates or something along these lines. I'm not sure if it was dates or dried figs. So in a way, you could enjoy and laugh at the scene he describes that relates to alcohol or drugs, but at the same time, you also learn a lot about the problems of the city. I mean, if lack of sugar was a problem for hashish smokers, imagine for coffee or tea drinkers, or for the makers of sweets in Jerusalem, baklava or knafa or any of that stuff. And it also takes you to the why was there no sugar? It takes you to the naval blockade by the British of the Eastern Mediterranean, the war economy, so it opens up, if you really want to look, not just get stuck that, he's talking about the people of Jaffa corrupting the morality of Jerusalem by drinking hashish. You could do that, but there's more to the story. It's layers in some sense.
Well, clearly he had a good grasp of what was going on in Jerusalem, because in 1917, when the British arrived under Ronald's tours, one of the first things they did, or I must say he, as governor of Jerusalem, did, was in fact to close down a number of businesses and establishments providing certain services, from brothel to certain coffee shops, exactly because in the view of the British, Jerusalem had to be a holy city and not a city for fun and entertainment, like any other city, essentially. So I think really the memoirs here are capturing that transition, which is also about our understanding of the city. Wasif lived throughout the Mandate era, and at some point he became disillusioned with the British, and you can really feel it through the memoirs, how his views have changed from the liberators. I guess from the perspective of someone who lived World War I in Palestine, in Jerusalem, suffering the consequences of choices made by the Ottomans, but then realizing that the British were bringing something different. How did his life change throughout the mandate?
Well, as you said, it's we have him during World War I conscripted and eager to get out of the service, of course. And the British come and arrive in Jerusalem December 1917, and it's a great relief, and it's the end of the age of tyranny, and he articulates it that way in the memoirs. But then later on, working with the British and seeing that the British mandate was bringing bringing the Zionist project, which is a project that will change the identity of Palestine and the city, more particularly in his case, the city of Jerusalem, and seeing the kinds of politics, and ending up himself in 1948 after he built a house in what became West Jerusalem, leaving all that and ending up a refugee, leaving West Jerusalem, not being able to return, where his house, even his memoirs were left there, and his photo albums and all that stuff, they were retrieved after 1967, by the way. So all that stuff, and then he ends up first in Jericho and then eventually in Beirut. So, of course, he felt that, he did not articulate it that way at the end. But you could see that he basically, from this flirtatious character in a city that is a city in some sense, has the elements of the city, into eventually being a refugee, a nobody in someone else's land. So you can see that tragedy. If I may go back a little bit to the Ronald stores and that period, you're absolutely right that the image of the city for the colonial power of Britain is that of the Holy City. And Wasif describes that struggle, particularly, describes how, I recall a scene when the troops were stationed in front of the different religious establishment. In the case he mentions is the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the troops will not allow anyone in unless they were Muslims, because this is the place of worship. But before that, in the Ottoman period, apparently they used to go, he and his friends, and just hang out in the gardens out there with their oud, enjoy. It was like a public place in the city, public space. And then how it was all changed, and how you had to prove you're a Muslim in order to enter a Muslim holy place, or a Christian in order to enter a Christian holy place, or Jewish, or what have you. But of course, he tells it in his own way. I mean, he tells us that story, how he, the Christian, was able to get in because he looked in the eyes of the British troops Muslim, while the blonde Muslim from, I think it was Nashishibi family, looked in the eyes of the troops non-Muslim, so he was not allowed to enter. So it's also all these stereotypes and that. So, in a sense, I thought I'll just mention this.
Well, it's fascinating, and it's obviously about perception, right? So, and I guess it's true even nowadays to think about maybe Muslims from the Balkans that might be, or from Russia, tall, blonde, blue eyes, and obviously they have a hard time to access, in Al-Aqsa Mosque just to pray, because obviously they don't look like how they should be in the eyes of the Israeli police. Whereas, you might be an Italian from the south, short and darker skin, but obviously Christian, but you may look like. So there's always this issue of really Orientalistic view and how people should look like in the eyes of other people, in this case, the British, who held control of Palestine by then. Wassif had, lived in a very, very harsh period of time for Jerusalem, where Jerusalem saw riots, massacres, rebellions, revolts, bombing. What is your understanding of how he negotiated all of these tragic events? How did he manage to go through all of these, period of time? So the early 20s, there may be rumors of riots, the revolt in Jaffa in 1921, 1929, the massacres, and then of course the Arab Revolt, 36, 39, and then of course the bombings by the hands of Irgun, the Jewish terrorist organizations of the David Hotel, King David Hotel, and then Ceramis Hotel, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, Wasif seemed to be always functioning within the community of the friends and the artists and the culture makers and some politicians, more than being directly involved in talking about that kind of violence. Not that he doesn't mention it, he mentioned it, but it's almost in passing, and you get the feeling, especially in the 1940s, which, by the way, is not included in the book, in the English version, because it's an abridged version. But there he mentions the news as if he's copying something from a newspaper. You know, there is no personal touch, no personal connection, so to speak. But then where it's rich is when he talks about his family or his friends or his brother or, you know, whoever. In that sense, you get into the more intimate details. And you get the feeling somehow of the loss, especially after 1948 and their departure from Jerusalem. You get a clear feeling about the loss over there, not only because of how he talks about losing his home, but also how his community shrunk. So rather than talking about, I don't know, zillion names in the city and this place and that place, all of a sudden we are in the Krontal monastery in Jericho, where his first place was with his family after departing Jerusalem. So all of a sudden the world shrinks, and there isn't much you know, excitement or connection. So you feel basically, I think that in some sense, if I have to stretch it somehow, the real meaning of the loss of Palestine for the Palestinians who went through what happened in 1948, their world was changed upside down, and everything familiar that they used to talk about is gone. And somehow you feel that with Wasif. But he has a lot less than anyone else I've read, so being Israeli or Palestinian or foreigner, in terms of this bombing or that bombing or what happened in this place. That's not you know, discussed in details anywhere. In passing, it is there, but not in details.
It sounds like, as a Jerusalemite, and Jerusalem being a harsh environment in many ways, from a natural perspective, the hills, the lack of water, the lack of resources, the poor connection, but also the tension within the different communities, or even within the same communities. It seems as he negotiated that the fact that there might have been incidents of outbreak of violence, which was some sort of a part of daily life, and yet, you know, still life could go on, and so it was like something to deal with, essentially. Yeah. I wonder whether this is some sort of an Orientalistic view, or if it's part of Jerusalem.
Well, I wouldn't call him Orientalist, of course, but I think he belonged to some sort of social class where his connection, I mean, of course, he suffered as any other Jerusalemite, and he suffered as a Palestinian in 1948, losing his home and all that stuff. But I think he functioned within certain social class somehow. He was part of the middle class that was proud to have connections with sort of the elite families or notables of Jerusalem, Hosseinis or Nashishibis or others, or before that with Ottoman leaders, Jamal Pasha or others who visited the city, or during the British Mandate, some of the British rulers or officers at the time. So he paid much less attention, like, you know, except for the Ottoman period, and only in relationship to the feudal landlord, the mayor of Jerusalem, the villages enter into the picture. Most of the time, this is a memoir of a middle class aspiring to be more of a upper class, I suppose. Maybe I'm exaggerating here, but it is really, you know, the peasantry that is an important element of daily life in Jerusalem. Peasants coming to the city are not there. And there are those, although he resents the British and resented the Ottomans, but he dwells on his relationship with them somehow. So I wouldn't call it Orientalist in that sense, more of a class issue, of lacking in class awareness that brings him closer to the working class or to the poor or the peasantry in that sense.
Just one last question about Wasif. So in 1948, he was displaced, uprooted from East Jerusalem. And that is an experience shared by Muslims, Christian, Jews, if you want to look at religious identities, but by many people who were Jerusalemites by generations, centuries at times, probably even earlier. And you get a sense that the Jerusalem he was talking about in 1920 was gone. So this is a memoir, and I was wondering if you think that he wrote this with a sense of nostalgia, or in fact he was just really trying to revive his own life and what Jerusalem looked like, and what even might have been in the future, or what it may be one day in the future. God knows. I want to be optimistic.
Well, you're right about your description. This is a Jerusalem that was completely lost, that he gives us, presents us. But I don't think he wrote because of some sort of nostalgia or vision of the future, because this is a mixture of a diary and sometimes memoirs. And although the final product in his handwriting was written in Beirut in late 60s, early 70s before his death, the style of writing implies that he was actually copying a diary or diaries or notebooks that he had before. Because when he describes a place, he says, this is, he talks as if he was there at that moment. And sometimes he even makes references that this place was changed and now it's the store of so-and-so. And that store of so-and-so could be the situation in 1930, but not in 1967. So he basically was reorganizing, I would say, lots of notes that he wrote from before. It's closer to a diary. It is a diary with sometimes some reflections and memoirs, but it tends to be largely a diary in that sense. So I wouldn't, the sense of loss of that Jerusalem, yes, the reader will feel that. I do feel that. But I don't think he wrote it because he wants to revive that sense of loss. He probably wrote it because he likes to write. His father used to write his diary. This is a tradition in the family. That's one. And the second thing, because he felt he was a special person who had interesting lives, not just life. And he, wrote about the wonders he saw in his life. And in some sense, what makes the diary interesting is this sense of, I would say, with all due respect to Wasif, that he was more or less a nobody, but through his memoirs, he appears to be a witness to all the great events, according to him. And therefore, it's like, when you read in the paper that there was the prime minister so-and-so visited a place and he was in the company of others. So Wasif is the others in this sense. You don't really know if he really was there or not, but he talks as if he was there and as if he knew every important figure in the city. So, I don't want to be unfair to him, but maybe he just inserted himself into the history and made himself a lot bigger than what he really was, which is okay. I mean, memoirs, you could do that. In fiction, you do that. It's fine in some sense, but I wouldn't take it for sure. We have no proof of all sort of details that he mentions, in which he was witness to, I don't know, grand events. But they were known in the city, and he's the only one, or one of the few, who actually wrote what was happening on that day. And through writing, he placed himself in the middle of the picture. He becomes, in a sense, an important element now of the memory of Jerusalem, British and Ottoman Jerusalem in that sense.
You edited the Arabic version, the English version. The way you talk about Wasif suggests that you're some sort of friend with him. Do you feel a personal attachment to Wasif?
As a matter of fact, I do. I became, I worked on this along with my colleague Salim Tamari for a very, very long time. This is a project that probably started, I cannot be certain of the year, but let's say maybe 1999 or 98, and continues to this date. So this is 2 decades in which I've known his daughter, his grandchildren. I've met or communicated with his son, the late son now, who's dead, the grandson, other people who knew him. So somehow, and then I saw his photo albums. In fact, a new book that is due to come out sometime this year from California University Press is on the photo albums of Wasif. And it's by me and Salim Tamari and Stephen Sheehy. And so I saw that, and we managed to get a recording with his voice. So all these things, all of a sudden, and I've walked into the footsteps of Wasif along with my colleague Salim. We identify which house where he was. We've went to the cafe where he used to go, and we went to the various areas in West Jerusalem where his house was. So somehow I feel like I became a Jawhariyyeh in some sense or another. Maybe I don't know. I feel we're really good friends. That I gave myself the right earlier to say maybe he's not telling the whole truth, as if I knew him well. But I feel we became almost intimate in an innocent sense, of course. In my knowledge of him, at least. Of course, he never heard of me, but I lived through his writing, and now I know his family, and in fact, there's also his musical notebook and the songs he sang. So one became kind of, I knew him in various ways, by talking to musicians who knew him, or by talking to family, or people involved in politics. So yes, I think so.
One last question, and I want to just go back to the beginning. Throughout the interview, we talked about buildings, places, historical events, sounds, smells, pictures. If you were to name 2 places of Jerusalem that you are associated with, 2 of your favorite spots, what they would be?
2 places. Well, I would say in terms of smells and, like I feel I'm truly in Jerusalem, is in the old city when I go through Damascus Gate, through Khan al-Zayt, and into the spice market. That is always where all these smells like bombard you. This is one thing. In terms of personal growing up and experience, in my time, the Salah ad-Din Street outside of Jerusalem was a place I was more connected to. And my father and uncle had a shop there that I used to work in the summer there. and then got to meet friends. And then when the Hakawati Theater at the end of that street was opened up in the early 80s, became a place to hang out and to go meet other people. So somehow there's that strip that starts from the beginning of Salah ad-Din perhaps and ends by the American colony or Sheikh Jarrah, that became part of my elder times as a young man or a man in Jerusalem, in terms of socially, but in terms of that feeling in the old city is very special. Though I cannot say it reminds me of a particular event or connected with a daily activity, but it is I don't know, it enriches me somehow just to go through that road.
This was Issam Nassar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roberto. Appreciate it.
Until the next podcast, thank you for listening. And remember, enjoy, share, subscribe. Thank you.